Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode 50 of the Retrospectives podcast, Dark Souls. James, did you ever think we would be spending time talking about Dark Souls all this time later when we first started with episode 1?
Yeah, I did actually, but I thought it would be in about, 10 years from now when it's actually a fucking retro game, Patrick.
I just couldn't help myself. You see, James and I on this show, we can't help talk about Dark Souls. We feel compelled to compare every single...
You feel compelled.
I feel compelled to compare every single game in existence to Dark Souls. I think it's one of the most influential games ever made, and I think that it's a masterpiece of genius game design in so many ways. And so we decided to celebrate our special
force you to justify your constant comparisons, your constant bringing up of this game that has somehow worked its way into every single, or almost every single episode of our show, Patrick. So, you've got a lot of explaining to do, and I expect you to justify your love for Dark Souls as such.
Those words sound so sweet to me, James, because there's nothing I love more, as my friends well know, than talking about the glory of Dark Souls. And now I finally get to, for the next, well, hopefully 6 hours, explain to everyone how brilliant Dark Souls is, which will create a lot of pain for you in the editing room, but it'll be well worth it, because I get to share with the world how great this game is. But maybe you'll be there to keep me in check and stop me going overboard.
Yeah, to pull you down as you float off into the sky.
So if this is the first episode you're listening to, we are the Retrospectives podcast. Normally what we do in each and every fortnight is we review a classic game of the past. We're breaking our rules. Normally we look at about 15 to 30 years old, and we're reviewing a slightly newer game, Dark Souls from 2011, because it's our 50th special episode. The goal of each and every episode is to determine if these games have well and truly stood the test of time, if they're worth your time to play today. We're not concerned about how good these games were in the time in which they were released. We just want to know how fun they are to play today, if, alongside the many Souls-like that have been released that have supposedly refined the formula in a whole bunch of ways. And while I would love to wax lyrical about the historical impact that Dark Souls had in 2011 and how it represented a change in the industry in so many ways, that is not our focus today. We're just going to be talking about how good Dark Souls is in and of itself, with plenty of comparisons to modern Souls-like titles.
In many ways, Dark Souls has been a yardstick for the games we've reviewed on this show up until this point. Patrick and I have often used its combat, gameplay, and storytelling as a measure for other older titles. So really, this episode is here to justify the use of that yardstick throughout the series.
Yeah, yardstick is a really good way to put it. We've compared these other games to Dark Souls, and we've said Dark Souls is how it's done right. So yeah, this is our thesis. This is our case for Dark Souls in a lot of ways. But we'll try to highlight the problems with this game, because it's not a flawless masterpiece by any stretch, something that we'll get into later. So for those who have been living under a gaming rock their entire lives, Dark Souls was an action RPG that was released in 2011 from Software, and it was originally released for the PS3 and Xbox 360. It came out a year later for PC in 2012, with the Artorias of the Abyss DLC included, which is very important to the Dark Souls experience. In one of the worst ports in video game history, I think, in a lot of ways, this really showed to the world that games for Windows Live is perhaps the worst DRM ever made. It was very painful for me back in 2012 dealing with that. Since then, it's been re-released with a remastered version for all the newer consoles on PC and even the Nintendo Switch. So I think before we get into the substance of our review, it would be useful for us to explain our prior experience with Dark Souls. So James, have you played Dark Souls prior to this episode? How many times have you played through it, if so?
So yeah, I got the game on release, having not played the original Demon's Souls, which released a few years prior. And I didn't know anything about it other than the fact that all these people online were claiming it as very difficult. And I, being the pro gamer that I am, decided that there wasn't a game that could be that difficult and bought the game in the hopes of, proving that I could beat it too. Back then, I think the way we viewed difficulty in games was quite different. I think that something that really caught me off guard was that when people were talking about the game as being difficult, they were more referring to its accessibility rather than the difficulty of the moment-to-moment combat. And this hit me like a truck when I first tried it in 2011. And I found myself bouncing off it 2 or 3 times, and probably on my 5th character, I actually managed to finally get past the bell tower gargoyles, and ended up, completing that run and falling in love with the game like yourself. Since then, I have played each of From's games. I have only completed, however, Bloodborne and won a couple of times. So for this episode, will be my 3rd time completing the game.
I also, like you, bounced off Dark Souls the first time I tried it. I actually played a bit of Demon Souls, but I played for a few hours, thought it was too hard, gave up. I got Dark Souls, and I got up to Sen's Fortress, found it too hard, gave up. I think that was my 2nd character. It was only when it was released for PC that I finally knuckled down and finally beat it. Since then, I have played through Dark Souls to completion, maybe 2 or 3 times, but I've played the first half of it in the DLC like 6 times. The latter half of the game is not the same as the first half plus the DLC. So I haven't beaten Gwyn, 7 times, but I've done a large chunk of the content like 6 or 7 times.
So I've actually only beaten Gwyn twice, with one of my playthroughs ending at the DLC and then not finishing 2 of the 4 Lord Souls. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, I've also tried to beat the game at Soul Level 1, where I got roadblocked by Ornstein and Smaug very, very badly, and, was unable to progress because I just wasn't good enough. And I also tried to do a run where I played with only fist weapons. Similarly, I also got roadblocked at Ornstein and Smaug, and never continued. Which is funny because, as we'll see, I beat them second try this playthrough, but that's a conversation I think we'll have later.
Yeah, I also did it's called a Dick Wraith run. The way invasions work in Dark Souls is that it's based on your soul level, but a lot of your power doesn't come from your soul level. It comes from the weapons you wield. So if you're prepared to go through the game at level 1, which is possible, you can obtain a super overpowered character and be invading others, and just trivializes the whole thing. It does require you to beat some significant challenges at level 1, which I did, and I don't feel a little bit bad about it because it was hilarious.
Absolutely. So just quickly, I played the game over this past week on the remastered edition on the PC, and had 0 issues with it whatsoever. It ran perfectly every time. Actually, I did have one. My controller stopped working, and I had to mess around in Steam to get it working for about 20 minutes. But other than that, no issues.
So I also played remastered on PC. It's worth noting that the remastered version is basically just a graphics upscale. If you have the original Dark Souls and you install DSFix, you will have 99.9% the same experience. There was one extremely annoying bug I encountered regarding a bug. At one point, you can kill a bug that will give you a helmet that emits light, but the bug that I was meant to kill clipped through the world and disappeared from the world, making it impossible for me to get that helmet that makes light. And that's just unfortunately a known issue with the game that I happened to experience, and there was no fix for it. So I had to deal with that. And occasionally with Dark Souls, there are little bugs like that. So that was very annoying. But apart from that, like you, I had no major issues.
Yeah, I would recommend using the remastered version over any other that you could. It runs, at a good steady frame rate, and isn't a pain in the ass to get going. So, good choice if you want to give it a go for the first time.
Okay, James, I guess, is it time to start talking about Dark Souls? I'm so excited.
Well, where do you want to start, Patrick?
So I think the best place to start is definitely with the story. When I've told people that Dark Souls has one of my favorite stories in video games, they've laughed at me and they've said to me, I didn't even know there was a story. And I could not disagree with these people more. I love the story of Dark Souls. The thing to understand about the story of Dark Souls is that the vast majority of the writing concerning it actually is about events hundreds and hundreds of years before the game actually takes place. So it's set during the twilight of the civilization of Lordran. This is where you spend all your time. But most of the writing concerns the age of Gwyn. So in the world of Dark Souls, it started off with there just being darkness. Basically nothing except the ancient stone dragons. Fire was created, creating a disparity between light and dark. In addition, there were these 4 powerful Lord Souls that emerged that 4 people took, who would become the gods and rulers of the new world. They fought against the ancient dragons, usurped them, and took control of a new world and the land of Lordran, which was basically a beautiful, beautiful city. And this was the Age of Fire. But the thing about fire is that fire fades. You can't keep a fire burning forever. Eventually, those embers are going to die down. And that is what happened. The fire started to fade, and the gods' time was at an end. It was time for a new age, the age of man, because man had access to the Dark Soul. So it was the natural passing of civilization. The time of gods was past. Now it was time for men. But Gwyn and the other lords didn't want this to happen. They didn't want that time to pass. So Gwyn immolated himself. He burned himself alive to keep the fire burning. And that worked for a little while, but the nature of fire is to fade. So it worked for a little while, but then eventually the fires faded again, and Gwyn was naught but cinder. As this is happening, the curse of the undead starts to take a lot of humanity. Humanity starts getting these rings on them, the darksign, and the darksign creates immortality, but it's a zombie-like immortality. Basically, you can't die, but every single time you do die, or you do suffer a temporary death, you become more hollowed, you lose a bit more of your purpose, you lose a bit more of your humanity. These undead start getting corralled into asylums to keep them trapped and keep them away from the living humans. The game starts proper with a mysterious person dropping a key into your cell, allowing you to escape and begin your quest. That quest is kind of vague, but what you are told is that if you ring some bells, something will happen. And hopefully, maybe you can solve this problem of the undead curse. That's all you get at the beginning of the game in terms of your story, because like I said, all of the writing, or the vast majority of the writing for this game, comes not in your personal journey through the game, but rather through the environmental storytelling and the story of what came before. I would put forward the argument that Dark Souls storytelling, its environmental storytelling, is really not that much different from a game like System Shock, BioShock, or Prey. It's just that the disaster that you've awoken to isn't something that happened 6 months ago, it's something that's happened hundreds of years ago. Instead of getting detailed audio logs about things that happened recently, you instead have snippets of myths and legends. You have dilapidated architecture that's fallen to pieces due to the entropy of time, rather than, mad murderous cyborgs or water pressure. And I just want to say, this kind of storytelling, environmental storytelling, will always be my favorite. And the way in which Dark Souls does it is no exception.
It does feel a little different to those games that you've described. Usually, in games like Prey and BioShock, you have these, audio logs, from characters who are telling you things very, I think, explicitly about the world that you're in. I think in Dark Souls, everything is a lot less concrete. There's a lot of vagueness in the world, and you kind of piece together the lore. In those games, it feels like you have these big chunks of lore and information, and you kind of, you get chunk A and then chunk B and then chunk C, and if you put them in the right order, you have a complete story from beginning to end. Dark Souls isn't like that. It's much more spotty and vague, and there's a lot of like hearsay and unreliable narration that, rather than get a concrete understanding of the world from beginning to end, you get this almost intuitive feeling of the world. You kind of know from all these hundreds of little pieces of lore and character discussion and item descriptions and, visual storytelling what's going on in each part of the world. And the world is very purposefully constructed. Everything is where it is for a reason. The places link together very naturally and logically, much more so than in other games. And, a lot of it is extremely vague, and you have to make lots of little fill-ins yourself. I'd say that in everything that you're given, half of the feeling and the understanding of the world comes from you yourself filling in the gaps. And I think that this vagueness is, much more present here than those games that you've described.
Yeah, the world has a real sense of place, but you're right that it's very light on detail. Perhaps a better example would be Gone Home, or I've been playing through these games by Cosmo D. They're kind of like these very surreal, walking simulator sort of games.
You can't give an example that no one's heard of.
They're very good. The middle one in the trilogy is called the Norwood Suite. They're games with very vague stories that you have to piece together. And I'm agreeing with you. I think that vagueness makes it very hard to actually know with certainty what's going on. But I think that given the nature of the world and the time gap since you were there, it does make sense that information would be this scarce. Like, it makes sense that there wouldn't be complete accounts, and it makes sense that you would have to try to join the dots.
It's also a very, I guess, a soft approach to the lore and the history. A lot of it's very, I guess, poetic in nature and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They don't explain anything in mechanical detail. Rather, they tell you these very... It's like when you read old mythologies and fairy tales, and they talk of these events where God took the left leg of the lamb, and from that sprouted a city. Like, all these nonsensical, vague poetic notions are underpinning the history and the lore. Like, lots of it, there's no way to understand the true nature of that event. You just kind of have to, piece it together yourself and interpret it in your own way.
Yeah, it's stuff like there is power in blood, and you burn humanity to keep the bonfires burning and to bring yourself back to life. It isn't a scientific explanation. It's like you said, it's a metaphorical, poetic explanation. But because the entire world hangs together on that poetry and metaphor, it doesn't detract from the realization and the truth of that world. I just want to say that I think that this style of storytelling adds a sense of realness to the place that very few games achieve. Obviously, the other From Software games, they've taken this as a framework and they've reused it again and again and again in Sekiro and Dark Souls 3, and to a lesser degree in Dark Souls 2. But yeah, the world has this ethereal quality, the world has this mythical quality to it, but it feels real. The world of Dark Souls feels real in the way that so many video games do not. And that's because they've put the effort into putting a lot of detail and effort into writing the background of the world.
And while I do also quite enjoy this style of storytelling, there are some downsides associated, as Patrick's friends obviously told him, and it's that many people can finish this game without knowing that there is in fact a plot, and that can leave a lot of the actions and events of the primary plot feeling very, I guess, video gamey is the best way to describe it. Like, you just go through these levels and you fight these bosses, and you don't really have a good reason or rhyme or reason as to why you're doing things. You're just doing them to progress because the game funnels you in these directions. And while I do think that having all of the lore and the story be kind of inaccessible and only shown to those people who go out of their way to find it makes it very rewarding. It does mean that the floor of enjoyment for this story is quite high, and a lot of people, aren't going to click with it.
But that's the brilliance of it. Dark Souls knows that it's a video game. It knows that it's a video game, and that when you play video games, you want to play the game. You put the controller in your hands and you want to kill monsters. You don't want to sit there and watch a movie. It's the opposite of a game like Uncharted or The Last of Us.
But
where
many
you have
people
a scene
do
where
want
you're
to do
walking.
that.
I understand many people want to do that, and I'm saying I don't want to do it. This is the brilliance of storytelling in video game that is unique to video games that I love to pieces, where you get to choose to engage with the story precisely as much as you choose, and when you sit down to play the video game, you get to play the video game. And that kind of gameplay experience is impossible if you don't do the storytelling in this way. So there's not a single game that does environmental storytelling that I dislike that I can identify. It must be a difficult thing to do because you need to write this really complicated story and then extrapolate from that into the future. But every time it's done, I love it to pieces, because if it's a good story, I can do all the reading, and if it's a bad story, I can just play the game.
Yes, but specifically as a criticism of the execution rather than the direction, those games you identified previously, BioShock, System Shock, etc., I think that many people playing through those games, without going to too much extra effort, can also know what the story of that game is while not being, railroaded into cutscenes, etc. I think that there's a distinction here where Dark Souls is almost too light a touch for a lot of people.
It is true that when you play a game like BioShock, you can listen to the audio logs while you're playing. So you get this idea, you can have the story delivered to you as you're naturally playing, instead of, pausing the game and looking at item descriptions. And the truth is, it's not like every time I get a new item, I'm like cataloging that item description and cross-referencing it against other characters. Most of the details of the story I get from external sources. I look at the wikis, I watch videos by Vati Vidya. But the critical thing, I guess, is that in putting the writing in the background instead of the foreground, it brings a richness to the world without shoving it in your face. It's like how Tolkien wrote reams and reams and reams of stuff underlying The Lord of the Rings. He did the Silmarillion and a bunch of other stuff. And even though you never see that detail, the fact that the detail is there underpinning the world still does a lot to bring the world to life, because there's a logic and sense to everything that informs the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that point. I think that, the entire world of Dark Souls has very clearly been fleshed out, and only, we see a very small fraction of that work in the actual game, but everything has some kind of reason behind it, even if that reason is a bit vague. And although, unlike Patrick, I am not so in love with these games that, don't shove stories in your face. I'm right in the middle. I like cutscene heavy games. I like, cutscene light games. I don't mind either way, really, to do storytelling. But one benefit I do see to this style is that I think the game gains a lot of replayability with this light touch. Every time I play through this game, I find a new item description that I haven't read before, or a new NPC that I haven't spoken to, or even an NPC that I interact with in a completely different way than last playthrough. So I feel that, in this specific style of storytelling, every time I play through the game, I pick up something new about the world, and it keeps the experience, somewhat fresher on each subsequent playthrough that I really appreciate.
Yeah, like, for example, something that I picked up on this playthrough was the whole story with the Fair Lady and Quelaag and Blighttown, and the fact that Blighttown was a mining community, and that's why there's all the holes in the walls as you're descending, and the fact that the Fair Lady sucked the poison out of the members of Blighttown, which is why she's sick. Like, this is stuff that, I mean, you may not even find the Fair Lady. She's behind a secret wall when you get down there. But they've built a story there ready for you to discover if only you can do it. And the fact that the story exists gives a realness to the world that just doesn't exist in other video games. So I would much prefer to have these stories be there in the background. Then can you imagine if there was a cutscene where a character, where Quelaag was explaining, about her sister, the Fair Lady, and the trials she had gone through to take the poison? It would have been horrible. I would have hated it. Instead, they write it in there naturally into the world, and it's there if you want to discover it. And to me, that's perfect. I love it to pieces.
Yeah, I think the lore surrounding the characters, the Witches of Izalith, is some of the best in the game. Unfortunately, their area is probably the worst in the game, but we'll probably get to that later.
We shall.
Before we move on, I want to talk a bit about the main plot. When going through it again this time, I did notice that the main plot is actually delivered primarily through exposition in stark contrast to the rest of the game, which is primarily, these little tidbits you get here and then, The plot in this game is introduced to you through an opening cutscene, and from then on, you hear basically nothing about it until probably midway through the game, where you get quite a large info dump from a character. This really stood out to me, because I always saw this game as, this brilliant environmental storytelling story rather than these big heavy-handed info dumps. While it isn't a super big flaw on the game to me, I do think that it's a bit weird in how uneven it is. You really only get any explanation as to what you're actually doing here, in like one single conversation in the entire 40-hour experience, and it is a bit kind of jarring when you want to know why the hell you're going through this world, what your purpose is, why these video gamey levels are funneling you down these roads that they are. And I do wish that there was more justification for the journey of the chosen undead.
So I really love the central thread of this story, precisely because of how subversive it is. So the main story thread is, if you ring 2 bells, something happens, because, what actually happens, it's been so long since anyone has rung 2 bells that no one even knows what happens when you ring the 2 bells. The 2 bells open a gate to Sen's Fortress, which is a labyrinth that you have to get through, getting all over these tricks and traps. You reach the glorious city of Analondo, which stands in stark contrast to the rest of the world so far. Everything's falling to pieces in the world around you. It's dark. It's dilapidated. It's horrible. You're going through swamps. You're having these disgusting creatures attack you. It's horrendous. You get to Analondo, and Analondo is beautiful. It's shining. It's the color of gold. Everything's impeccable in Analondo. There's no fallen down structures. It's literally perfect. And there's this grand castle with the most challenging fight. The most difficult challenge you face so far, at the very least. You open the doors, and there is a gorgeous woman in front of you. Light is coming through the ceiling. She's huge. She's beautiful. And she tells you to kneel. You kneel in front of her, and she goes, "Chosen undead, you have proven yourself worthy to link the fires." So now you've got a goal. You've got to link the fires and continue the legacy of Gwyn. Seems simple enough. So you get all the souls, you link the fires, and you immolate yourself to extend the Age of Fire. So that's the primary story that I would say most people experienced it. It's certainly how I first experienced it when I first started playing. So I assume the info dump that you're referring to, James, is the secret one where you have to do some weird sequencing in order to gain access to it?
Well, I'm actually talking about both. Midway through the game, depending on your actions, you will be greeted by one of 2 primordial serpents who have existed for many ages as far as you're aware. And then depending on which one you speak with, they each give you a different info dump, and then from which, you can make a final decision at the end of the game with. I suspect that you really enjoy the subversiveness and the trickery
Yes.
and the confusion and vagueness that is within the main plot. I also enjoy that. What I didn't quite like was the fact that the main plot is only presented to you in this conversation in the entire game after the first cutscene, and then there is nothing else in the entirety of the game. And that many of your actions aren't that like a kind of weird and unjustified. Like half of the people that attack you, I don't know why. I don't know why I'm going here. The chosen undead is essentially a self-insert character, right? They're you. They're your vessel, the player in the world of Dark Souls. And so you break out of prison and you are taken to this place. Now, what is your first response to being taken out of prison? Is it I'm going to find shelter, food, and make a life for myself, or I'm going to go into this undead infested city and fight all these monsters for God knows what reason?
Oh, so you're saying that the main character should have a motivation outside of ending the curse?
Well, is that his motivation? You
Yeah.
don't know, really, because you just escaped prison. That's all you know, right?
So basically, Oscar drops the key to your cell, and then when you speak to him, in that conversation where he gives you the Estus flask, he says there's an old legend that if you ring the bells of awakening or whatever it is, then you can end the curse. So your motivation for doing what you do is to end the curse, and then when you see Guinevere, she tells you, chosen undead, your job is to link the fire, which presumably is tied to the undead curse, although that's never really made entirely clear. It's a standard hero's journey. You have this quest and the undead curse, and you don't really know how ringing the bells is tied to it, but it makes sense that you don't really know how ringing the bells is tied to it, because the people who would tell you are all dead and gone, and the reasoning that links it all together has fallen to myth and legend.
I guess my feeling is that, like, if this happened to me, gallivanting off into the undead burg filled with monsters is the last thing that I would be doing.
Well, you're the hero, right? Like, you're the hero of the tale, and that's the brilliance of Dark Souls. It puts you in the position of the hero, and you unthinkingly do what the hero does, because that's what heroes do. But the genius is, you were an idiot. You never questioned who is benefiting from this, who gets the power from me doing all these things. It's postmodernism 101. When you start questioning the nature of the quest, then you get to the truth of Dark Souls.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the primary playthrough, I feel like we've had this argument before, but our positions were reversed. In fact, you wrote a big article about why you didn't think that the storytelling in Cave Story made a lot of sense for exactly the same reason, where a lot of the Chosen Undead's actions, much like Quote's, don't make a lot of sense given his circumstance.
I think that the difference is that if Cave Story was a story about, was a Dark Souls games, I would have been able to kill the grandma to get the key instead of rescuing the dogs. So there's one thing in my favor, because Dark Souls lets you kill any NPC, so there's that solved. I think the difference with the Chosen Undead is that you have been locked in the cell. You're presumably hopeless. You have a very real reason to end the curse, so you're not cursed anymore.
Okay.
Like, you're affected by the curse and you're motivated to end the curse. So I mean, that makes sense as a motivation for me.
Yeah, for me, I find it to be a bit too light on the primary plot overall. I think that if there was maybe one or two things, I think if they took the big exposition dumps and spread them out across like 3 across the whole game, it feels very weird to have this one huge, here's the story, and then nothing for the rest of the game unless you're looking for it. Because it's pretty hard to avoid these particular exposition. I guess maybe they thought that they only wanted to give the player this one guaranteed bit of story, and so they had to, give them heaps right there, so that they knew what the hell they were doing. It just seems kind of antithetical to the rest of the spread out, lore and the method of delivery.
Well, when you consider that Guinevere is an illusion created expressly for the purpose of deceiving you, it makes sense that it's an info dump. But so the idea is that Guinevere is an illusion created expressly for the purpose of deceiving you. You're basically, it's a creation. Frampt is in on that game, so when you see him, he reinforces that message that you've received. The truth of the matter is super hidden and hard to discover. I do agree that could have been easier to access because it's actually ridiculous what you need to do. I can't imagine many people would discover that naturally. Yes. On any playthrough. It's ridiculous. I mean, you can figure out something's fishy by attacking Guinevere and the whole city turning dark, but the precise steps you need to take to access Darkstalker Caith is a bit too far for my liking. But the idea that it's hidden in secret is important to some degree.
Yeah, so I think that you largely agree with me in that Dark Souls is a game that does a good job at environmental storytelling, but maybe if it had, I think the execution on the main, like the ideas and the actual, story beats of the main plot, I agree with you, are great. I think it's the method of delivery that could, use a bit of improvement in execution.
Specifically, I wish Darkstalker Caith was slightly more accessible, or there were more hints as to how you access him. But I think everything to do with the main story tricking you into following this hero's journey, so unquestioningly you immolate yourself for the glory of Gwyn, I think is brilliant, and I wouldn't change a thing. I just think that there needed to be a bit more to give you a few more hints towards the truth.
Okay. I think that immolating yourself unquestionably makes no sense.
That's what the hero does.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Kind of one of the problems with this subversive storytelling is that in making a mockery of yourself, you kind of reduce the legitimacy of the plot. It is like a good criticism of the hero's journey that, they just do what they do because, that's how the story works. But, in the moment of Dark Souls, it makes not a lot of sense. And if you're not clued in on how subversive it's trying to be, well, it's going to seem like a pretty shitty story, right?
I mean, I just think that basically, like I alluded to earlier, I like that the story, there's not much substance, there's not much, it doesn't dump a lot of detail in your face. So while I can understand the people who say, oh, Dark Souls doesn't have a story, I mean, in a way, I'm laughing at them because they've kind of missed the point.
I mean, I think that criticism is absolutely a fair one. It does not hold your hand with the story, and to some degree, I think that what makes the story rewarding is the fact that it doesn't hold your hand, but I think it's still a valid criticism that you can play through the entire game without knowing what the hell's going on.
Saying Dark Souls doesn't have much story is as much a criticism as saying The Last of Us has too much story. I mean, you take whatever amount of story you like in the end of the day, and I like the way Dark Souls does it.
I mean, it's a criticism of delivery rather than substance, right?
Sure. So I'm just saying, I think that people, I think at the end of the day, you can either appreciate stories that don't hold your hand or stories that do. You can appreciate both. But a blindness to the kind of story that Dark Souls tells, I mean, I just feel sorry for the people who don't get it.
I don't get it. I see how it is. All right.
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a brilliant thing. I can understand. I would just ask that those who criticize it at least try to understand it before dismissing it out of hand.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I do think that the story really shines if you do multiple playthroughs. You're probably not going to be able to discover the real story unless you look up how to do so on the internet. And that is a real legitimate criticism. I don't think there is anything hinting towards these other things.
Yeah.
And I think that, the methods of delivery is a problem here. But I do really like the substance of the story of this game. I do like how subversive both of the second playthrough is. And, overall, I think it does a great job of, slowly doling out little interesting tidbits about its characters. So, we've been going on for, a good 40 minutes now, and I think it's time for our first music break. This is probably the longest we've spoken about the story in one go of a game. Patrick, how did you feel about the soundtrack, and did you have one that you would like to share with the audience?
So I like the soundtrack of Dark Souls, but I think this is one area of the game where the soundtrack has been surpassed in the later From Software games. Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and Bloodborne in particular all have superior soundtracks overall to this game. That being said, there are specific tracks on the Dark Souls soundtrack that I love, but I think there are a lot of pieces here that kind of sound a bit samey and aren't nearly as memorable to me. I think the first piece of music I'd like to start with is the piece of music that greets you when you arrive at Firelink Shrine. It's very beautiful and meditative and calm. And every time you come back to Firelink Shrine, and you come back to Firelink Shrine a lot of times from a lot of different directions, you can feel your heart swelling in relief, and it feels like home. So this is Firelink Shrine.
That was Firelink Shrine. I think that if I had to sum up my opinion of the soundtrack of this game, it would be that it does a good job of stirring the right emotions at the right time, but I don't think that any of the songs on their own is particularly memorable, and I agree with Patrick that the later From games have done a better job with the soundtrack. There are, however, 2 or 3 pieces which I think are absolutely brilliant, and I will be happy to share them with you a bit later.
One of the things I'd like to highlight about the soundtrack is just when the music plays, because the vast majority of your time playing Dark Souls will be with no music whatsoever. Most of the music is in the boss fights. So what'll happen is you'll be playing the game and you'll just have the environmental effects. It's a very immersive experience with not having that music. I've talked about this before, that music can detract from your experience. So Dark Souls feels like a very dark and kind of atmospheric, but it's an oppressive atmosphere. It's just you, your sword, your shield against the world. And then when you enter that fog gate and get into the boss fight, that's when the choir swells. That's when the music really hits you with an intensity to really help put a highlight marker on that moment, saying this is the important thing. This is what it's all about, this boss fight. And I have to say, all the From Software games do this. They often have a piece of music playing in a safe haven like Firelink Shrine, but I think it's a really effective use of music and one I like a lot.
Yeah, oftentimes they don't have any music playing, which is very different to a lot of games. There's a lot of silence, which really makes those times when there is some music roaring in the background all the more notable. And I think they do use tracks quite effectively through a number of points throughout the game. In particular, I think that the music that plays during the end credits is very poignant and, I guess thoughtful, and you really think about your journey over the past 40 hours as the credits roll.
Like in a game like Thief, although Thief had a mechanical reason to not have a loud and obnoxious soundtrack as you were sneaking around, Dark Souls has less of that. But the thing about creating an atmosphere that makes you feel alone and scared and overwhelmed is that when there's no soundtrack there, when there's no music, and you hear that noise in Blighttown, it's terrifying. And if there was music playing, those sounds, those subtle sounds, could very well have been drowned out. So I just want to say, for this game, it was the correct choice to not have music playing all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you want to actually start talking about some gameplay? We've almost been going on an hour without even mentioning it, and it is the yardstick we use for the gameplay of a lot of other games.
Well, I think the first thing to talk about is the level design. So, if I had to pick one thing that defines the first Dark Souls game, one thing that Dark Souls, I think, does better than any game ever made, ever made, I'm talking about up to the year 2020, I haven't seen a better example of it, is its macro level design. The way in which its levels fit together on a large scale. So, most video games have levels. Some video games have open worlds. But what Dark Souls macro level design do is it overlaps its different areas over one another in incredibly creative yet logical ways. So the entire first 6-7 areas of the game are tightly interwoven in all these clever and creative ways that are also natural and feel logical and make sense. And as you play the game and the world becomes increasingly interconnected, as you activate lifts, as you open gates that were locked, as you discover just new pathways by defeating difficult enemies, it feels wonderful. Every time you discover a new link through exploration, it feels better than anything. The feeling when you go down that lift in the church and you discover that you've returned to Firelink Shrine again is one of the best exploratory feelings I've had in a video game ever.
Yeah, I think From's always been pretty good at creating these little shortcuts in levels, even back far in Demon Souls, which Patrick and I were actually playing together a couple of weeks ago. Many of the levels do wrap around back on themselves, so when you progress, it's not because you've gotten to a new checkpoint. In fact, oftentimes you'll be at a bonfire, which serve as your checkpoints in this game, and you'll have explored for a good 10 minutes, only to, kick a ladder down to that same checkpoint and allowing you to, cut out a good 10 minutes of your exploration. There's a lot of interesting shortcuts and interlocking levels that take place in Dark Souls. But I, unlike you, am not as high on it in this game. I do think that there are a lot of areas which are a bit less, I agree that there are a bunch of areas tightly wrapped around Firelink Shrine, but I think a lot of the extremities of the directions you can explore are quite, remote and isolated from the rest of the game. Specifically, Lost Izalith and, most of the DLC, I don't think is quite as impressive as, the Undead Parish or even, New Londo Ruins, which I think connects to the Valley of Drakes and to the main shrine quite well.
I mean, to a degree, that does make sense, though, right? Because if you're going to design a world, there's going to be extremities somewhere. To create a world which is so intricately wrapped upon itself that there's no extremities, I think doesn't make sense to me. And I kind of like that the Lord Souls, these lords that have retreated, I guess, into their own corners of the kingdom, would be disconnected from the central clump that makes up Lord Run. So I don't identify that as big a problem as you do.
I think the same thing was present in Demon Souls, effectively. I think the best levels in that game do a similar thing, where many, levels are interconnected in interesting ways, because each level segment really only has the one checkpoint that you wrap back to constantly.
So just let me address an idea there, like Demon Souls wrapping level design, for example, which for Boletarian stuff I'm really big on. I would make the point to distinguish between the macro level design of Dark Souls, which is that it's got like 6 to 10 areas all tightly interwoven and connected in interesting ways, and the micro level design of a level like Boletaria, which is a nice helixy sort of loop that keeps looping in on itself. Because that is something that I think that From Software has become very good at. The Cathedral of the Deep in Dark Souls 3, I think, is one of the best executions of that idea ever. What I think that Dark Souls does best is the macro level design, the connection of all of these disparate areas in different ways. And that's something that has never been replicated. So Dark Souls does checkpointing through bonfires. And once again, it feels a bit odd talking about this stuff because Dark Souls is such an influential game that hundreds of games have taken their bonfire system, but before they did it, they were one of the first.
What? It's just a checkpoint. What do you mean they've done it the first time? It's a checkpoint with a couple of options attached to it.
Well, I would identify one of the things they did uniquely with that checkpointing is that when you rest at a bonfire, all of the enemies respawn. And for Demon Souls, that just meant that the enemies respawned. You know, Demon Souls didn't have bonfires. Demon Souls, you kind of had to beat the levels and rely on the shortcuts. But in Dark Souls, that whole concept of the balance between, do I rest at a bonfire to give me the opportunity to level up and spend my souls and replenish my health items versus all the enemies coming back, was a real tension-filled moment for me for my first playthrough. And to me, I think Dark Souls was one of the first games to do it.
I mean, when you die in Mario, you have to play the level again with all the enemies. Like, it's no different, right?
But you don't have that choice. Like, it's less relevant for my current playthroughs because
when is that choice
I can
ever
just
relevant? Like, every time I come across a new bonfire, it's because I found a shortcut and I immediately rest at the bonfire to get more, Estus, more ability to heal myself. And then using that same shortcut, I can proceed down this new path, which I hadn't gone down before.
Okay, let me explain it to you because, this is back when I'm brand new to Dark Souls. So I hadn't ever played a game like this before. It was brand new to me. I was a first-person shooter gamer. I bought my first controller for my PC expressly to play Dark Souls. So I found this game extremely hard and intimidating. And I remember that bonfire, before the Taurus demon, where there's the bridge and there's 3 undead in that building and then there's people throwing firebombs at you. I would go forward, get firebombed, try and fight those undead, lose a lot of health, and I'd earn a certain number of souls. I would be out of Estus at the halfway point between that bonfire and the Taurus demon. And I needed to make a decision. My decision was, do I try to press on with minimal Estus and get into fights where I don't have Estus? Should I try to press on when I have this amount of souls that I can level up with? Or should I go back to the bonfire and level up and get my health back and try again? And on my first playthrough of Dark Souls, I faced that dilemma constantly. And it seems silly now, right? Because I'm so much better at these games. But for my first playthrough, that was a constant struggle I had. That tension existed all the way throughout the game.
I didn't have that feeling a single time in this last playthrough. That seems absurd to me.
Me neither.
Thinking about it now, you keep going until you die, and then you respawn and you try again. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
that's all there is. There's no if I've lost Estus so much at that point, I either haven't kindled my bonfire enough or I deserve to die.
So basically, this is one of those things where, because Dark Souls was the first to do it, and because I was new to this style of game, because I didn't understand, and because people didn't understand, you were scared of losing your souls. You're like, oh no, I lost 1,500 souls, and you'd feel really depressed and bad about it. Our understanding of these mechanics has become a lot better, and we kind of understand that it actually doesn't really matter if you lose a few souls here and there. So you just keep pushing through till you beat it. But at the time, it was terrifying. But this is all to say that that checkpointing system, I think, is in practice. I think I broadly agree with you. It ends up being a checkpointing system, and I say that as a veteran of Soul games and as someone who understands it today. Would a new player feel the same way? I'm not sure, and I think that they are a bit more than a new checkpointing system. So if you've never played these games before, it's going to feel very different to how it feels for me today.
I think the level design and the checkpoints in this game are really well done due to the way the level design often wraps back around to the bonfire. So, you could do these 3 long sections of a level using the same checkpoints, just having a bunch of different shortcuts available to you to, get past a lot of tedium. And I really like that. I think it makes the world feel very natural. I like the fact that when you die, you respawn instantly. There's no load screens or anything like that. And, because of the nature of having to go through this long, frustrating experience again if you die, it solidifies that feeling of oppressiveness that exists in the world and the lore. There's, when you die to a boss and you go all the way back to a checkpoint, because in this game, there are no checkpoints before bosses, so if you die, you have to go all the way back, and then you have to do the whole level and then fight the boss again. So there's this real feeling of fear that's instilled in the player because of this. And I think that it has a couple of interesting effects on the player, because I think the best way to play these games once you've gotten good at them is to play very aggressively and very confidently. Playing scared actually gets you hit and gets you killed a lot more than it should, because, you're giving the enemies more time to attack you. And, when I first played this game, I, like Patrick, wasn't used to this style of game where I think every enemy in the world is a threat to you, not just the bosses. Because I think in a lot of games, there's lots of, throwaway enemies where you can mash attack to get through, and then the boss encounters are where you have to get serious and focus. Dark Souls isn't like that. Every single enemy in this game world is a threat to you and can kill you.
Torch-wielding hollows, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're fucking deadly.
yeah, and I still die to stuff like that, even in the earlier levels occasionally. And, being a new player to the game, when I encountered this, I was met with a lot more resistance than I was expecting. I wouldn't say that any enemy in this game is particularly, super hard or difficult to fight. It's the fact that compared to other games, the mooks posing an actual threat, that's the difference, right? Instead of being fodder, they are legitimate threats to your person, so you have to put a little bit of effort in order to overcome this. And I think that the effect that that has is kind of interesting to me, because at first you're super hyper-aggressive and overconfident, which is actually how you're supposed to play the game once you're good. But, you meet this unexpected resistance, and as a reaction to that, you start playing a lot more defensively, which gets you killed more than it should, because you're playing the game wrong. Once you've, gotten better, it's like you become confident again, and then you start adopting that, aggressive play style. So I guess, kind of the learning curve for me was interesting in that, I started playing it the right way, and then was conditioned to play it the wrong way, and then, realized and got better again.
See, I disagree with your characterization of it. I don't think playing defensively is the wrong way. I think that that's just how you play when you learn the game. I mean, Dark Souls mechanically has a lot going on. It's a lot of complicated plates to juggle if you haven't played that kind of game before. Yes, it is, absolutely.
I think it's quite simple. If you compare the combat of this game to something like a Devil May Cry game or Bayonetta or some other, third-person action game, there's a lot fewer buttons, a lot fewer moves, but those moves have more weight behind them and more consequence, I think.
It's complicated because you don't know what matters. Dark Souls throws a lot of mechanics at you, and you don't know what matters when you first start playing. Is elemental resistance important? Is the fact that your armor, the stats on your armor, important? Do you need to infuse your weapons? You've got magic and you've got miracles. When really, I agree with you. Once you understand what's going on, it ends up being simple because it's just dodge the enemies, manage your endurance, get in hits when they're not hitting you. It's easy, right? But that's not easy to grasp when you first start playing. When you first start playing, you don't understand poise. What the hell is poise? Nobody knows what poise is when they first start playing. People don't understand endurance management when they first start playing. That's one of the things that takes ages to learn. People don't understand the concept of spacing when they first start playing. Oh, I can just back up and be out of the range of enemy attacks. People don't understand the versatility and importance of the moveset of that given weapon, or how dramatically the experience changes when they're using different weapons. I think that it seems simple to once you understand it all on an intuitive level, but when you first start playing, yes, you're going to play defensively, and you should play defensively until you learn these things. I get what you're saying. When you grasp that if you can just roll and hit enemies using iframes, it does seem simple. In order to get to that point, you do need to start off playing defensive.
I reckon that if you don't have that reaction that I did, and most people did, at the start of the game, you'll probably reach that state where you're good at the game a bit faster. Like, if you just keep ramming your head against the wall with this aggressive playstyle, I think you're gonna have a lot of dividends, but I think that the game railroading you into this defensive playstyle works in its favor thematically and to the effect of the story almost. Like, when you get good at this game, the way your character plays the game makes no sense. In this, this dark, oppressive world, there's this guy doing these backflips and, crazy backstabs and all sorts of silly stuff.
I mean, you've got a point. When you're good at this game, the world doesn't feel nearly as scary as it should. But definitely when I was starting, the world was terrifying. And I would always go very slowly with my shield held up, ready to get ambushed from any corner. I think one of the things that makes the world design of Dark Souls special is the indifference of the world to your existence. This isn't a evil overlord sending his army of minions to stop you. This is the entropic and naturalistic decay of the world that is getting in your way. When you're trying to navigate Blighttown and the boards are shifting beneath your feet, giving you an unsteady, platform, no one's designed Blighttown that way. It's just Blighttown has fallen to pieces. When you're forced to go over the buttresses and then eventually over those ridiculous planks of wood above the Analondo Cathedral, you do that because the last person who used the lift left it in the wrong position for you to get across. The world does not give a shit about you. It is indifferent to you. You're a cockroach or a mosquito buzzing or scuttling around this world. And yeah, I think that the level design, the way it forces you into these uncomfortable, unnatural pathways, is a really good way of reinforcing that. And then eventually you find your shortcut, you open the gate that you are hoping to get through again, and you can see how the world was meant to be traversed before it all fell to pieces. But yeah, I just want to highlight that the hostility doesn't feel like directed hostility against you. It's just, this is the state that the world happens to be in.
I think it does in Sen's Fortress, which is specifically designed to test people, because otherwise those giant pendulum blades make no sense in the positions they are.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sen's Fortress is absolutely an exception, but even Sen's Fortress has fallen apart in a lot of ways.
It still has guards. So that's the thing that makes no sense about Sen's Fortress, is that it's this dilapidated building, but its guards are still like working the night shift or something. I don't really know what they're doing there.
So basically, those serpent guards, they work for the Dragon Seath. And I think the theory is that they kidnap people who try and brave Sen's Fortress, and they end up taking him back to the Duke's archives so Seath can perform experiments on them. But, it's Dark Souls lore. That's just a working theory. It's just the idea is that that's what Big Hat Logan was trying to do. He was trying to get into the Duke's archives.
Yeah, if you make enough gaps in any story, you can make it coherent by filling it in yourself.
Hey, at least it's an explanation, right?
So yeah, let's hone in on the combat a bit more a bit more closely now.
Okay.
As I alluded to before, unlike a lot of other games, Dark Souls never really lets up with resisting you as the player. You know, there are no segments where there are heaps of fodder enemies that are of no threat to you. In fact, the places with heaps of fodder areas are, in fact, probably some of the most dangerous because that's where you let your guard down and get ambushed by these, these torch hollows, as we spoke about before. So something that I really like about the combat is that each and every enemy encounter is meaningful. You're not, slapping your way through these mashy areas where you just mash the attack button and hold forward. You have to stop and think about every single encounter, and I find that really enjoyable and really engaging. Because in a lot of other games, boss fights feel very, I guess, tacked on because they're so different to the rest of the game, when really here, bosses are just big enemies with more health, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about the importance of moment to moment gameplay, Dark Souls is always the game I'm thinking of. When I'm complaining this game has bad moment to moment gameplay, this game has good, Dark Souls is the yardstick. Because, like you said, each and every enemy encounter is meaningful because it's threatening. But also, it doesn't really throw the identical encounters at you endlessly. It continues to spice it up, with good and clever enemy placement. For example, let's look at one of the early game areas, the church. So from the starting bonfire at the blacksmith, which is the closest one, you first come across 3 hollows guarding the side entrance to the church, one of which has a crossbow. So you've got 3 enemies, you need to decide how to engage them, the order in which you engage them, how to approach it. When you walk into the church, there's a big armored knight with much more HP than anything except the optional black knight enemies that you fought so far. He's got a big mace, a lot of health, he hits hard, but he has obvious wind-ups. Okay, there's another different encounter. When you go up the stairs, there's a boulder knight with a rapier standing on the stairs. So it's an incredibly narrow area, and you have to figure out how to take on this fast knight that can also parry you. It's dangerous and difficult. You go through to the main second floor landing of the church, and there's a million hollows that can be buffed by a spellcaster. So in the space of 10 minutes or 5 minutes or however long you choose to run through it, you've got these 4 unique, different feeling encounters, all of which can kill you if you're not careful. And Dark Souls does this the entire game long. It is never content. Well, I won't say it's never content because there are some dubious areas. There are some dubious areas towards the end, but I'll say most of the time it continues to escalate and change up the exact nature of the encounter while still having it appropriately lethal the entire time. So as you move through every area, you get a unique kind of encounter that's enjoyable and engaging on its own merits.
Yeah, the fundamental, I guess, core of the gameplay really is observation and exploitation. When you encounter a new enemy, you observe them, you see how they attack, you think, where about on the enemy can I attack without getting hit in return, There's this guy with a big slow club, so you kind of watch him, you watch his attack patterns, and you attack him in the opening. This isn't a game where you both just rush at each other and if you have the bigger sword you win, although that is possible. The game really rewards you for, learning your foe and taking advantage of their moments of weakness. And I think because it throws new enemies at you and new enemies and configurations at you constantly, you're always being challenged to think, to learn, and to overcome, and that on itself is extremely engaging, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, so we should emphasize, so I called Dark Souls an action RPG at the beginning of this episode to define its genre. And it is an action RPG, but it's very, very, very much on the action side of the RPG scale, even though it does have a wealth of RPG-esque mechanics, because victory, let me put it this way. Victory and beating Dark Souls is because of your abilities to play the game well, like your mechanical abilities, reading enemies, dodging them, as opposed to maximizing the role playing aspect of your character, having a perfectly, it's not about your numbers, it's about your abilities as a character, abilities as a player more than anything else.
All right, Patrick. We're going to go into something high level a bit because, to be frank, I could not disagree with you more. See, like you, I love Dark Souls, and I probably hasn't come across in the show, but it is also one of my favorite games of all time. But, Patrick brings it up so often that I feel like I don't have to, so I just let him go with it. But unlike him, the thing I love about this game isn't the environmental storytelling or the interesting way that the levels connect with one another, or even the way that each encounter is very unique. What I really like about this game is that it caters to the fickle nature of being a human the entire time you're playing it. And so to explain this, I kind of want to introduce three ideas that are the three different ways that a player can progress through a game, any game. And to me, these are mechanical skill, information advantage, and raw effort. So to elaborate, mechanical skill's pretty obvious, right? You're really good at your reaction times, dodging enemy attacks, attacking. You're good mechanically at the game. And Patrick is suggesting that this is the primary method with which players will be interacting with Dark Souls, and I don't really agree, because I think that my favorite thing about Dark Souls is the fact that it puts all three pillars evenly throughout the entire experience, catering to, a wide range of playstyles and different players and methods of engagement with the game depending on, your mood at the time of day that you're playing it. So in addition to mechanical skill, there is information advantage, or knowledge, which in Dark Souls kind of manifests its way in knowing the level layout ahead of time, or knowing where items are. For example, it was more prevalent to me in this playthrough because this is my umpteenth playthrough of the game. This is my like 10th character or something, even though I haven't finished the game that many times. I know where every item in the game is. I know where all the powerful items are located within the game, and I can use that to my advantage, and players who don't know that can look it up online and use that to their advantage. So an unskilled mechanical player can make use of knowledge this way, by, going out of their way to get a powerful item early and having that carry them through the game. This kind of way of getting better at games is more pronounced in things like puzzle games and card games, where I guess mechanical skill isn't as big as a factor, but raw knowledge and understanding things that your opponents don't is really important. Finally, effort is most seen in, RPG games. Grinding is the primary way with which a player can overcome skill through raw effort, even if they aren't very smart or they're not very mechanically skilled. A perfect example of this is my very first character of Dark Souls, which, when I first played, I was very bad at this game, like a lot of people. So the character that I built was one who wore the heaviest possible armor, had a massive great shield, and basically took 0 damage from anything because I'd spent so long grinding souls to upgrade all of my gear and my character level and my health. So when I got to the DLC, the final boss of the DLC, Manus, is quite difficult. On my very first fight with Manus, I beat him first try by mashing the attack button and running into him because I had so much armor and health that he couldn't damage me. I was able to beat this fight not through, mechanical skill or knowing my enemy with knowledge, but through sheer effort of grinding my character. Because when I got Havel's Great Shield, I saw that the stat requirements for that item were very high, and I thought that it would be really cool if I could wield this shield. So, I spent a couple of hours or so grinding my character up into the point that he could wield that shield, and from then on I beat the game quite easily because, my character was overpowered. I think that it is Dark Souls' greatest strength that it can cater to all sorts of players doing all sorts of different playstyles. You know, the mechanically skilled players can beat this game at level 1 because its mechanics are so tight. Players can get an information advantage by getting rare items, by, like, as Patrick said earlier in the episode, doing these, like, Dick Wraith playthroughs that leverage that knowledge. And less skilled players can get through the game through sheer force of will by grinding. And, you know, at any point in your playthrough, depending on how you feel, you can approach the game in a different way, which is something that I think a lot of other RPGs do very poorly. Earlier in the show, we did a game called Lunar Silver Star Story, which Patrick absolutely detested because it did not allow. Because Patrick is a more a mechanically inclined player, right? He wants to leverage his ability to overcome challenges. Lunar only allows you to interact with it on the axis of effort. You know, you put effort into grinding, you can beat the game, it's really easy. Your knowledge and your mechanical skill never plays any part of it. It's simply, you know, stats, and, you know, that's it. Whereas Dark Souls rewards you as a player for growing in any different way that you want to or feel like you want to at the time, right? If I want to, you know, browse wikis and learn where cool items are or cool shortcuts are, I can do that and it'll make me better at the game. If I don't want to do any of that and I want to beat the entire game with pure mechanical skill, rolling, dodging, learning enemy patterns, I can do that. And if I want to beat the game by grinding my character up insanely high, I can do that. The game rewards you no matter how you choose to engage with that, and it's really enjoyable as a result. So I strongly disagree with Patrick's assertion that this is a purely mechanical game. I think that all of these other ways make it very fun and engaging and rewarding for all types of players to engage in, and I love that about it.
So let me start by saying that I think people can enjoy any video game in any way that they choose, and I encourage them to do so. But I think that there is a way that you should engage with Dark Souls, broadly speaking, to get the most out of the experience. And while I can get on board with this idea of mechanical skill and knowledge, although I would also include exploration in that. Like, I think that the way that most people should engage with Dark Souls to get the most out of the experience is to try and explore everywhere. Sometimes there'll be enemies that are too tough and you don't want to deal with. That's fine. You can come back later. But try to explore as much as you can, and then you fight the boss. And you upgrade your weapons, and you use its RPG systems to augment your character to make them stronger. But at the end of the day, I view Dark Souls as an action video game where you're, you know, using your endurance management, your spacing, understanding the moveset of your weapon, you're studying the boss's attack weapons, you're looking for backstabbing and parrying opportunities, you're changing between blocking and using, invulnerability frames on your rolls. That is the way I understand and appreciate Dark Souls as a video game. Is it possible to grind up lots of souls and trivialize challenges? Sure. Is it possible to put Havels on and face tank enemies? Sure. But I think that if you play the game in this way, that you are cheating yourself of the Dark Souls of experience of being exposed to challenge and gradually overcoming it by improving your abilities at the video game.
Yeah, that's fair. I think there's like a degree of wiggle room here too, where you come up to a boss you can't beat, and so you come up with a unique solution using the RPG elements. I think that that's a pretty common occurrence for this game, right? Like, you don't have to RPG cheese the whole game, just, specific sections, and that can open the game up to a lot of people. I think that while I agree with you that it's the most fun and rewarding even to approach this game in a purely mechanical sense, I think that, the RPG systems And, the knowledge gained from exploration and, possibly, using wikis to look things up can really help a lot of people to enjoy the game that otherwise wouldn't. Because, you and I, in our current playthroughs, we didn't do a Soul Level 1 playthrough. If we were truly, purely mechanical players, we would have done that, right?
Well, what I would say is that the word that I would take exception to there is the word solution. I don't think there is an RPG solution for your problems. And I think that if you're looking for a solution to your problems, you're not really understanding what Dark Souls is about. The RPG systems aren't there to solve the problem for you. They're there to augment and assist your basic mechanics. For example, when you go to Blighttown for the first time, there's these guys blowing toxic darts at you. And they give you toxic on 2 hits. They're silent darts. They're sniping you from afar. It's very dark. Basically, getting toxic is a huge problem at this stage in the game. But you don't need to do anything special to get past these guys. You can dodge the toxic dart guys. You can go a different way. However, there are options available for you to help you mitigate the problem. There's a clump, the blooming purple moss clump, that will remove toxic from your system that you can buy from a specific NPC, the female NPC in the sewers. Or there's a shield, the bandit shield. There's a couple of copies of it, including one in the area just prior, that gives you 100% block for all poisons. So if you can block their attacks, you'll completely absorb the toxic with no problems. Now, you haven't solved the problem of the toxic guys. You still need to navigate these areas. And nor do you need it as a solution because there's nothing to be solved. You can get through these areas without it, but it's a way to help mitigate and deal with the problem of the area. And that's why I like Dark Souls. It's an action game, but there are lots of little bits and pieces that can help push you towards victory, but they don't do them in and of themselves.
I think solution's a good word for, solving some things. Maybe not that example you used, but for example, when I fought the big dragon Calamite, I was finding that all of its fire breath attacks would kill me with its first hit. And when I was first fighting the boss, I wasn't good enough to dodge them. So, obviously the solution there is just to get good and, learn to dodge the attacks. But also something that I did do was I swapped out my gear and I put on a piece of, a gear that was more fire resistant. So, while I was still taking a lot of damage, I wasn't getting one hit, and that allowed me to learn the fight better because I was staying alive longer. Like, I agree with you. There's lots of little interlocking pieces that add depth to Dark Souls, and I think that everyone's playthrough is going to be very different because there are so many little bits and pieces that you can use to your advantage, and I think the degree that you take advantage of these things is going to differ per person, and that's really the best part of the game, is how it caters to all sorts of players, playing with all sorts of different weapons or magic or pyromancy, because, even if you come up to a boss that's extremely difficult mechanically for you, you can make it easier for yourself with these, these little tricks. Overall, I do think that it is primarily mechanical, but I think the degree that the RPG systems matter are very significant and do add a lot to the experience.
Yeah, it's funny because I think we're kind of in the same place. We're just approaching it from opposite directions. Where you're saying that the addition of the RPG stuff being able to make a difference is good. I'm more saying that the fact that the RPG systems don't make that much of a difference is good. The thing I love about Dark Souls is this idea that at some stage you have to fight Ornstein and Smough. And you have to understand endurance management, and you have to understand how to, control the aggro on them and use the pillars to break it up. Regardless of what your build is, with exceptions, of course, there's always going to be builds that can cheese anything. For the vast majority of builds, you have to learn that fight, and you have to beat it. And it's not about getting the numbers right, it's about getting the mechanics right. And the RPG mechanics push you in the right direction, but the thing I love about the game is that, for me, at the end of the day, it is about the mechanics, and I love that about it.
Yeah, you like that if you played the game at level 1 with no gear, not even a weapon, you could probably beat the game if you were good enough, right? Like,
it's less that, it's more that the main thrust of the game is about mechanics, and the RPG stuff is there to push you in that direction. I mean, level 1 runs a fun gimmick that I think are cool, but I guess I just like most of the focus being on the action side, and I like how the RPG stuff is a light touch.
It would annoy you if the RPG stuff got in your way, though, right? Like if you had to do these things, yeah.
If like beating Calamite was about putting on the fire resistance gear, if that was the key thing, it's like, okay, so I've got all my fire resistant gear and I found these rings of fire resistance, so now I can fight the boss. If that was the thought process and the focus, that would really drive me nuts. But the focus is on overcoming the boss through mechanical skill. That's what I like about it.
Because for me, when I first played this game, I was the opposite. I was annoyed by the focus on mechanical skill, and I liked the RPG elements. But, you know, even though we came at this game from different directions, it still catered to both of us just fine. I think there's a lot of depth and a lot of breadth of experience that's possible with this, and I love that about it.
Do you mind if I just talk about like an aspect I like about the RPG system? Because I've been ragging on it a lot. So what I really like about the RPG leveling up system is that I feel like it's a really good way to express a diversity of play styles as opposed to it being about you gaining raw strength. And you do gain raw strength over the course of the game, I get that. But the way in which you gain that strength, I feel like leveling up is about defining a character to fill a specific role, usually tied to a specific weapon or a specific school of magic, than it is, I am getting stronger as a guy. Instead, your strength seems to be more tied to the power of your weapon, which is on a fairly linear scale as you explore more and more areas.
Yeah, like most of these stats are just, you need to meet these checkboxes so you can wield specific weapons, and it's not like, when we did Crystallis, if you're not high enough level, you can't actually damage a boss. That was absurd. There's nothing annoying about the systems. They don't hold you back mechanically. You can play the game in spite of them if you wish. But they are here, and if you're one of those players who wants to play a game with a certain flavor of character, like often Patrick and I play a lot of card games when we bring this up, but in Magic the Gathering, there's lots of less skilled players, I'd say, who have this idea of a deck built around a certain thing. Like they want to play their unicorn deck, whereas most of the pro players' decks just have a bunch of the best cards and they don't have a unique flavor tying them together. But in Dark Souls, you can absolutely make a character and be like, I'm going to be a cleric with with holy powers and beat the game this way. You can do anything you want and beat the game if you can overcome its mechanical challenges. So it lets you do whatever you want. Speaking of which, I'm kind of interested in how you did your most recent playthrough.
So I did a faith strength build.
Okay.
So my given weapon was a great club. It was pretty great. It took me a while to be able to wield it, but two-handing it reduced the strength requirement to something reasonable. And then I was using lightning spears and a buff from the miracle side of it. So I started off just using whatever I could find, but then I just built towards this big heavy weapon build. It was quite interesting. I relied on using it's been a while since I've played Dark Souls 1. Played more Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro recently. And Dark Souls 3 has lots of rolling, and Sekiro has lots of parrying. But the rolling in Dark Souls 3 is very different from 1. So I started off trying to just two-hand iframe roll every single enemy, and I failed pretty miserably. So I started leaning on a shield for about the first half of my playthrough. But as I guess, picked up my muscle memory of the mechanics of Dark Souls 1 again, I went back to putting the grass crest shield on my back for the increased endurance, and I just stopped using a shield altogether. So yeah, rolled around two-handed with a great club that I infused with lightning.
Yeah, I also leant on a shield a lot more at the start, like you did, and then like slowly, as I got better at the game, I guess graduated to the school of iframes. Um,
Mm.
a few weeks ago, Patrick and I played Demon Souls together, and at one point in the playthrough, I picked up this weapon, and Patrick said, "Don't use that, it's garbage." And this little voice inside my head rebelled against that statement and said, "Fuck you, Patrick, I'll do what I want." And that manifested itself in me playing through the entirety of Dark Souls 1 using a crossbow. And I gotta say, I went into it thinking that it was going to be super cheesy for the entire run, and it really wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be.
Wait, you fought the bosses using a crossbow.
Yes,
You fought like Ornstein and Smo using a
Ornstein
crossbow.
and Smo. Yep, I beat Artorias with a crossbow. I beat Manus with a crossbow. I
Jesus.
beat, I think, every boss in the game except Four Kings with a crossbow. Because
Because you need a DPS them
yeah,
down.
so crossbows do a lot of damage, actually, but there is a big gap between their attacks. So when you press shoot, your character stops for half a second, shoots, and then like stands still for a full second. So the overall DPS over a long period of time isn't very high because of that waiting. But it
Mm.
actually makes for really fun boss gameplay because that like huge delay at the end of your attack where you're vulnerable means that you have to pick and choose your attacks very carefully. So actually, something I like in video games is when different builds have trouble at different parts of the game. And in my first playthrough, and in many people's first playthrough, Ornstein and Smaug are an absolute nightmare to get through. In this playthrough, I beat them second try, and the first time I only died because someone knocked on my door. Because, they're really easy to kite and shoot with a crossbow. However, another boss that previously was very easy for me was incredibly difficult with a crossbow, and that was the Moonlight Butterfly, which was, up until Four Kings, probably the hardest boss I'd fought with the crossbow because the Moonlight Butterfly is a boss that flies around in the air, throwing projectiles at you, and then after you dodge enough of its attacks, it lands and you can attack it. However, the bridge that you're standing on, the place that it lands, cannot be hit with a crossbow. So my only choice was to shoot it while it was trying to shoot me, which was actually quite hard, and I died many, many times trying to do it. But I felt really good when I finally did it. This wasn't the like hide in a corner, cheese a boss to death playthrough I thought it was going to be. Actually, it was quite engaging throughout the entire time, and I think that the difference between me, playing with a melee weapon my first playthrough and playing with this one was different enough that I found the whole experience to be enjoyable, engaging, and overall still difficult, which I wasn't expecting at all. I will say though, grinding up lots of souls to buy ammo was a bit painful at times.
I am actually shocked that you did that. Like that's to me, that's the definition of like a gimmick playthrough. And I get it, you can do it, but that's ridiculous. When I played through Dark Souls, I was just killing people. I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna kill this, swap to this
Well, it
weapon,
made
yada
it
yada
made the
yada."
mooks a lot easier for the most part. Like killing normal
Jeez.
dudes was way funner. Well, like more chill because you could just take them out.
Well, that's very cool, James. I'm very impressed. I yeah, my build is far more standard in comparison.
I did use the Moonlight Greathorn spear to kill because I like that boss fight was crazy, so I was like I want to get the boss weapon for this boss because it was hard and that was
Hmm.
fun. So I used that because I had a bit of magic. Like I was using magic to conserve ammo. Like I wasn't purely like I didn't use purely crossbows the entire time, but every boss I used the crossbow for. Um, Things that were really hard were anything that was fast and in a confined space was terrifying. Because, like, when you shoot, you're so vulnerable to things rush. Dogs? Fuck dogs. Dogs are horrifying. They are the scariest enemy in the game. I I gave up on the road to Calamite and used a melee weapon to take the dogs out on
Hmm.
the way to that dragon because it's just too hard to shoot them. They just and Artorias To the credit of this game and its great hitboxes, there's this attack he does where he ducks down and he rushes forward with his sword thrusted in front of him. And then a second later, after he's finished his attack, he stands up. Every time I dodged that attack and shot him, when he stood up, the bullets would whiz past his face. Like, there was no way I could hit him after he did that attack, because, you know, the hitboxes are that tight, and it's great.
Were you able to stop Artorias powering up with the crossbow?
So I got the crossbow in Duke's Archives that shoots 3 bolts at once.
Oh, yeah.
So...
The Arbalest, or whatever it is.
Yeah, Avalon.
That's it.
And in 2 shots, it counters his power-up, so it actually worked out really well. But I still had to get good at dodging all his attacks, because, that boss is really fun and really hard.
Nice.
I want to talk about the bosses.
Let's
do
have
we want to have a music break?
Yeah.
So in celebration of us talking about the bosses, let's have some music from one of the boss fights. I think the one that is most ingrained in my mind is the Minotaur demon from the start of the game, because it's
Taurus
the one I've
demon,
heard
yeah.
the most. And I actually do the Taurus demon, I quite like it. So here's the Taurus demon. It's a good example of, some of the boss encounter music.
So that was the Taurus demon theme. So now it's time for us to talk about one of the key moments of the Dark Souls series, and Dark Souls in particular, the bosses. We've already alluded and spoken about bosses and how they are an experience, as kind of like a way to highlight the end of each area. But it's time for us to go into a bit more detail on the bosses and something specific to certain bosses and how bullshit they are. But the first thing I'd like to talk about is the notion of boss runs. So, Dark Souls has a thing. You'll finish exploring an area, and then, you'll have explored everywhere. You'll encounter the boss, and it's a tough boss, and you'll die to it. You go back to the bonfire, which is often some distance from the boss. It's often not right nearby, and you have to get to the boss again. So, James, the thing I want to ask you, because I have my own opinions, but we'll start with you. What do you think of boss runs? And do you think that there should be a checkpoint or a bonfire that emerges right before the fog gates of most bosses or some bosses? Or how do you feel about boss runs as a whole?
So, something that you've convinced me of over the course of the show and our discussions outside of the show, and I think something I've probably slingshotted to being ahead of you on in some ways, is that I've become over the years a huge fan of games that are thematically consistent both with their story and their mechanics, even past the point that some would agree is reasonable. So in this case, I think that Dark Souls is a game that tries to offer this sense of oppressive atmosphere and isolation and, an uncaring world and a dangerous world. And I think that in this game specifically, while boss runs don't really offer anything mechanically meaningful to the player, they do a really good job of being thematically consistent with these ideas that it's trying to convey. So when you die to a boss in Dark Souls, you're sent all the way back to a checkpoint like 10 minutes ago. So, the next time you get to the boss, you're fucking terrified of dying because it's threatening your time and patience. You're terrified of dying because, you got to spend 10 minutes of running back to the boss, and the world does not care that you think this is bullshit. It doesn't care for your time. It's a challenge and you have to overcome it. So I think that it does a really good job of being cohesive with the rest of the game, story-wise and thematically, even if it is a bit meta in some ways. I think that aside from the boss runs in Dark Souls, the only other thing I've experienced in video games that gives me real fear of failure is when playing Minecraft and you see a creeper walking towards, this house you've been spending hours building. That shit's horrifying. These kinds of, mechanical fears, as opposed to, I guess the creepy tension you'd find in a horror game, is something I kind of value a lot in these tense experiences, specifically here in Dark Souls.
So I've probably got a flatter take on it than you do. I think that for the early, mid, and maybe even the first half of the late game, I think that this design is good. And the reason I like this design is because I think that after thinking it through and talking to some of our members on our Discord server, it's kind of just like a natural consequence of naturalistic level design. You have a bonfire here because it's a reasonable place to have a bonfire, and then you have the boss arena here because it makes sense that that's the boss arena. And it's not going to make sense if you have the bonfire outside the boss every single time. It would give a kind of staleness and repetitive feeling to these beautifully and realistically designed environments. So it's like a price I'm willing to pay for the naturalistic world design, because I agree with you that mechanically, I don't think it adds a lot to just hold down the sprint button for a minute as you run through a path that you already know. Where I think it's less forgivable is where you get to the very, very, very end game. So the hardest bosses in the game right at the end of the game, because I think at that point I'm willing to pay the price of it being a slightly less realistic space if I'm not forced to waste my time running for a minute. I mean, I've explored most of the world at this point. We're at the ultimate challenge that the game is giving you. It's saying, well, this is it. This is as hard as it gets. I think at that point, I just want to really get into the nitty-gritty of actually learning to fight this boss. So I think most of the time it's okay, but I think that the changes they made in the newer games of putting bonfires immediately before these final bosses was a good change. And I think having to do the Manus and Calamite runs in the DLC is particularly aggravating.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say it that way. So when I first played Dark Souls, the idea of sprinting past every enemy to the boss felt like cheating. So when I beat the game the first time, I never did that. Every single time I killed every enemy on the way to the boss for my first playthrough, because, it felt wrong to sprint past everything. Nowadays, I don't give a fuck. I'm like, I just want to fight the boss. These enemies, I've done them before. But, originally, I had to get good at the path to the boss as well as getting good at the boss, because if I wasn't good at killing the enemies, I lost Estus, and I had to fight the boss with reduced health and reduced resources, and it was a bit of a pain. So I guess it was less of pointless tedium than just sprinting there. It was still annoying and it was painful, but it felt like more meaningly painful than it does for me now, where I just sprint past them all, where it feels, pointless and tedious more than anything, rather than a part of the entire challenge. Like, I viewed the levels from start to finish as one challenge rather than just the boss as its own thing.
It's interesting. I think part of that is that the early game bosses, when you're learning, are actually deliberately designed to be very difficult to run through. Particularly the run to the gargoyles, if you don't execute it perfectly, that gang of hollows the channeler is near will block you trying to get through, and then you just get attacked by 30 guys and die. So all of those early areas have a lot of enemies in kind of choke points that make it harder to run through. And running through with, rolling past enemy attacks is a skill in and of itself. And there are areas like, the Capra Demon. That area to the Capra Demon with the dogs and the rogues that burst out of the walls. Good luck trying to just run through to the Capra Demon. Like, it's going to be so hard. So there are areas where I fight enemies, but like you, I mean, I know how to do these areas. Once I've fully explored an area, I'm like, yep, I've mastered this. Just fighting them over and over again doesn't really prove anything or achieve anything. So yeah, I kind of think that when you get to the end game, just let me fight the boss. That's what I'm here for. The run to Manus is just stupid.
That one's not so bad. The one that really shits me off is the one from the bonfire to Ornstein Smell. That, across the whole bridge, from the starting bonfire.
Ah, James, you don't know the trick. So the bonfire you use is the one near Solaire, the one that you drop down after beating the archers. And then the spiral staircase, if you go up the staircase on one level, you can jump over the edge of the spiral staircase onto the second floor, which has a staircase connecting to Ornstein and Smo, and it's about twice as fast as.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Bridge. Yeah, someone had to tell me about that. It's not obvious.
Yeah, I found a new one recently, and I was trying to look for it online, and I can't find anyone else doing this, but I found this really fast way to get to Four Kings, which is you rest at this bonfire that's in Darkroot Garden.
Yeah.
Take an elevator down. You go down the lift.
Yeah.
You go across the Dragon Bridge. And then in that first room to the left, there's this heightened ledge and a weird, bit of terrain that if you sprint and jump on, you can actually, weirdly jump up that ledge, which is right next to the boss.
Ah.
Yeah, and,
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, because part of the level design takes you to that ledge, and I was like, what the hell? There's nothing there. There's no items or anything. There's just one enemy, and I was like, what's the point of this area? And then I realized it was right at the gate, so if I found a way to awkwardly jump up there, it cut out so much time. It was I reckon it takes less than a minute to get to the boss that way.
No, that's cool. I've always gone from Firelink Shrine, so yeah, that sounds far faster.
Yeah, it was awesome. So I mean this is the natural progression of a game that's super replayable, right? You learn these things. And you get to, get better at the game every time you play it. And I think these kind of things, the build variety, I know we're supposed to be talking about boss fights here, but I think this game is very replayable, and I love coming back to it because I can always apply these new things.
Let's talk about some of the bosses. So for me, I would, I guess, group the bosses into kind of two rough categories: puzzle and gimmick bosses, and then combat bosses. I would say gimmick bosses are stuff like the Capra Demon, Bed of Chaos, Ceaseless Discharge, whereas the combat bosses are Ornstein and Smo, Artorias, Manus. Most of the bosses in the game, I think, are just combat bosses. So, James, my basic statement is that I think that puzzle bosses are shit and combat bosses are fun. I don't really enjoy any of these gimmicky or puzzle bosses, whereas the ones where I get to get into arena with a sword with an enemy, learn that moveset, that's what I'm talking about when it comes to bosses.
I think the Capra Demon is the right way to do a boss that rewards you for making good use of the terrain and the environment, and the wrong way to do it is Better Chaos, which is just a complete clusterfuck, the worst boss in the entirety of the front of the Soulsborne catalog. I think it's fucking dreadful, and I hate that piece of shit.
It's one of the worst bosses made, full stop.
Yeah,
in video
it's
game
so
history.
Yeah, it's you go down there, and there is this, this boss, and it's got these two glowing points that you have to hit, and that's fine. So you hit the first one, and then the boss wakes up. And, it seems like you're just running to the other point, and, it swings its hand at you, and you dodge it, and that's cool. But then the floor underneath you collapses, and you die instantly. And then you repeat the corpse run, and you die in 4 to 5 different holes before you realize the safe route. It's like trial and error of the worst possible kind. I hate that shit.
Bed of Chaos is famously bad because it kind of goes against a lot of the other design principles that inform all the other fights. And it's got one final nasty trick. So after destroying the two things, you think you can see a tree branch like in the middle, that it seems obvious you're meant to go down the middle and jump into it in the gap in between its sweeping hands. So as you run up, finding the perfect gap, you jump down the middle, only to see as you fall to your death that it curved out of your sight.
Yeah.
And every single time I do that fight, I forget and I die and I jump in the pit and I want to throw my controller across the room.
It's funny because there are these two tiles that are like jutting out forward, and if you sprint across them and just drop down without jumping, you still land on the branch. So it like almost tells you where to do it, but there's no way to know that until you've died to it the first time. That entire area, Lost Izalith, fucking infuriates me because not only does it have some of the shittest visual design execution-wise, because there are these copy-pasted enemies everywhere and everything looks very clashing against these terrible lava textures, but it has the characters whose lore is my favorite, the Witches of Izalith, come from this area, so I was always really excited to get there to learn more about these characters, only to be met with this complete clusterfuck of a boss and level design.
Let's go back to the Capra Demon, because you said that's an example of a good boss design. I actually think Capra Demon is terrible. So I think Capra Demon's fine in theory. Big tough enemy with two dogs and a staircase that if you can get up, you're basically safe. But the main problem is the exact design of the arena. It's a little too narrow, and the problem is that as you're coming through the fog gate, your vision is obscured, and the enemies start moving to attack you. So getting that first roll dodge is super awkward because they're already pretty much attacking you as you're emerging from the gate, and you have to find the exact window to get that roll. Because if you press it too early, you're still stuck in the fog gate. So I don't like that. And I think that the arena is slightly too narrow even then. It could deserve to be widened a bit.
Yeah, I agree with you that the execution's poor. I kind of meant the direction.
Sure.
I think that, like, direction-wise, Capra Demon having this environment... Like, even Ornstein and Smaug, their arena has these pillars that you get to make use of. I think that that's enjoyable. I think that having the environment have this, like, I don't want to say puzzle, but have this, this aspect
wrinkle.
Wrinkle for you to take advantages of is fun. But once you become, a pure puzzle, it's it loses its replayability and it becomes a bit of a chore.
Yeah, Ornstein and Smaug is probably the most famous fight in Dark Souls for good reason. I think it's a fascinating fight. It's probably the biggest difficulty spike in the game. Like, I think that once you've beaten Ornstein and Smaug, I think for that point in time, it's the most difficult fight. And although there are more strictly difficult bosses, I think by the time you get to them, you're
more prepared,
better equipped to... Yeah, you're more prepared to deal with it. You've played Dark Souls for long enough that you know what you're dealing with. But Ornstein and Smaug really put you to the test because they're relentlessly aggressive and they keep chasing you down, and your windows to get damage in is very small. You need to be managing aggro of both enemies. You need to be managing the defense, like your endurance, the endurance spent on defense versus rolling versus attacking. And they're unpredictable. They both have a wide array of moves that overlap in different extremely annoying ways. And sometimes you need to wait 45 seconds because they just happen to be overlapping in ways that aren't giving you windows to actually attack them. I think that overcoming Ornstein and Smaug is probably the best possible feeling you can have playing Dark Souls, because you can't really beat them without nailing the mechanics, and you will fail a lot trying to beat them.
I mean, you can stand behind some of the pillars and shoot them with a crossbow.
Okay, sure. In most instances, you cannot cheese them, although James somehow magically found a way. But at least in all the playthroughs I've done, I've had to beat them. I've beat them fair and square, and it's always satisfying to do so. I will say that one of Ornstein's attack, which is this flying charge he does against you, is ridiculously buggy.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, he kind of like decides to go in the charge, and then even if he gets stuck behind a pillar or smoke for 10 seconds,
Yeah.
he'll continue to be in this flying mode until he makes contact with you.
It is very weird. With the boss fights, I really like the process of getting better at them. When playing these games, what usually happens is you'll encounter the boss for the first time, you'll proceed to get destroyed in the first 10 seconds, and thus begins this process of getting good. So running back to the boss and, trying again and again and again, and each time you learn a bit more, maybe you figure out that this one attack pattern can be beaten by rolling at this time or at this angle or by blocking, and then you'll slowly get that knowledge for each of the boss's attack patterns. I think the best bosses, in the game are primarily in the expansion Artorias of the Abyss. I think that Artorias, Manus, and Calamite are, great bosses and are probably still up to the standard of From's current boss design. Whereas I think a lot of the ones in the base game are starting to show their age because they're not as
Particularly in the latter half.
yeah, because they're not as fun to learn the mechanics of. The thing that makes the other bosses stand out is that they all have, like a dozen different attacks. You need to learn all of these attacks in order to beat them because they have so much health that, even though they have so many moves, you're going to see each move like 10, 20 times per time you fight them. So you really, really need to know everything about the boss in order to beat them. Whereas some of the earlier bosses, like, I don't know, like the Gaping Dragon, they have like 2 moves. So you learn how to beat them extremely quickly, and it's not that satisfying to overcome. The process of learning doesn't take as long, and although, for newer players that can be frustrating, I really these days revel in the state where I'm learning the boss. Like that midpoint of learning the boss where you're still losing a lot, but you can feel yourself getting better. That's really satisfying to me. And even though I'd beaten Artorias and Manus before, going through them again and having to relearn their patterns was really fun.
Yeah, it's this weird thing with the curve of enjoyment with the difficulty of the bosses, because I think a lot of the bosses in the early game, up to Ornstein and Smough, are actually quite good. Gargoyles is great. Taurus Demon is a fine first boss. I think Quelaag is an excellent boss. She's quite easy, but I think that she's got a very interesting move set, and the way she affects the arena is interesting.
I think the explosion is a bit bullshit.
Yeah, I got I died a couple of times to it when I got caught in her legs actually, which was pretty frustrating. But it's got a very clear tell, so you can always avoid it.
Yeah, I think the first time you see it, there's no way to know what's about to happen.
Yeah, that sucks.
And that's kind of annoying, but other than that, it's okay. You can learn it. I think she's fine. I think my favorite boss from the early game is probably, I actually can't think of one.
Gargoyles? Gargoyles are pretty good.
It's okay. I don't love it.
I mean, so the problem is we're too good at these games now, so we just kind of breeze through these bosses without challenge.
Well, I don't think it's just us. I think it's the gaming world has moved on since this game came out to begin with. Like, I reckon if I go and play Bloodborne, like the second boss, Father Gascoigne,
Yeah,
will
to
kick
be
my
fair,
shit in because it's
yeah.
so hard, and it has that same learning process that the DLC Artorias of the Abyss bosses has, where you have to learn all its moves and slowly get better.
Gascoigne is probably the hardest early game boss in any From Software game. I mean, I guess the closest is like the in Hollow Knight when you fight against the mantises. Like that's a boss fight that I find pretty easy, but I still really enjoy. So yeah, I broadly agree with you. And the bosses get even worse when you get to the end game, not including the DLC. Seath is a terrible boss. Nito's a pretty bad boss. Four Kings is okay, but it's basically just a DPS race. And even Gwyn just feels like thematically he's a husk, so it makes sense that his move set would be fairly simple. But compared to the final bosses in the other From Software games, he's a huge disappointment.
Gwyn's hitboxes are like shockingly fair. Like, if you dodge your attack and you look like you should have dodged it, you do in that fight. Whereas this boss I hated more than any, like, other than Better Chaos, the boss I hated was the Demon Fire Sage, where I feel like so many of its attacks, I looked like I had dodged it, but it hit me anyway. I found it really annoying, because if you stay at its arse, it doesn't use those attacks, which is nice, but pain in the butt to fight.
Yeah, you just get behind him and keep running back and forwards, and then you eventually kill him. Terrible boss, reuse boss.
Yeah, it's kind of unintuitive to stick in his ass with a crossbow, but we'll. But that's what I get for using a silly build. Overall, I want to say that I think that From's boss design has improved over the years, and that Dark Souls ones, are showing its age in a lot of fights. There are a lot of really boring ones. Only one outright bad boss, but the DLC I think is primarily excellent overall. I don't think it's got the best level design in the original game.
Let's talk about that, because you mentioned that before. What I think the level design in the DLC is very good. I think it's a good example of the looping level design. The way you keep opening new lifts and everything is interesting, and you eventually use one of the what's your problem with the level design?
Because they're all the same lift, it feels very gamey. I don't know. It doesn't feel as natural as the other shortcuts because they're all using the same one. They're all lifts, right? They're all just a different lift, and I found the forest kind of boring to navigate. What I did like about the DLC was I thought the environmental storytelling of the town falling into the abyss. Like, you don't need to be told that. You just look at it and you know a whole portion of the story. I thought that was excellent. You've read about Artorias in the main game, and when you see him acting all, possessed and stuff, you can kind of tell what's going on, I feel like the DLC says the least, through text and words, but still says a lot. And I really enjoyed that. And, of course, as I've mentioned, I think 3 of its boss fights, I think Sanctuary Garden's okay, but the other 3 are superb, on par with From's modern design. And overall, like, the best part of the base game.
The story is just kind of cool as well. Like, I'm a sucker for time travel, so I just love this idea of Artorias is famous for fighting the Abyss, but Artorias got corrupted, and it's really you traveling back in time that fought the Abyss. But no one knows, and the legend has always been that Artorias is the one who did it. So that's just a funny thing. And the idea of the people of this town torturing the furtive pygmy until he turned into Manus is just like fucked up. Like it's incredibly dark, and I like that kind of like that hidden detail about how they fell to darkness, and that's why there's hexes and everything in the world. It all ties in thematically to the mechanics they introduce. So yeah, the DLC is superb. I mean, From Software always do good DLC. I'll even admit that I hate Dark Souls 2, and the apologists for it make me mad, but Dark Souls 2's DLC is excellent. So
I think I'm actually going to play that game now that I finished 1, because I don't remember why I didn't like it as much, and I want to remember. I guess we'll find out why.
Let's just say we're not doing Dark Souls 2.
Well, it'd be such a good episode, though, for the criticism. Just briefly, or maybe not so briefly, we always compare the boss fights in From's games when we talk about boss fights in other games. What do you think it is about these ones that make a great yardstick, per se?
Okay, so it's a few things. So the first thing is the moveset. You want your bosses to have a varied moveset that requires you to react in different ways. And from the good FromSoft bosses often have 5 to 6 different attacks that they use in different ways. Bonus points if they have different versions of the same attack. Like, for example, Super Smo has a swing that he chains into a second swing if you're close to him, but if you're not close to him, he only does a single swing. Stuff like that does a lot to keep the boss fights interesting. Number 2 is the tells of the boss, the animations, the indications that they're going to attack. You need to be able to identify when a specific attack is coming. So if they're just doing the attack out of nowhere or the tell isn't super noticeable, that's a real problem. Pretty much all of these bosses give an indication of the kind of attack they're going to do, whether it's a sweeping attack, an overhead attack, a charge at you. Calamite is actually really good in this regard because
Yes.
it's subtle, but you always get an indication of whether he's going to do a head swipe or a charge, and you need to react very differently for the different attacks. So
Yeah, he has like 3 or 4 different breath attacks, and after fighting him yesterday for quite a while, I was
he's
able to
tough.
tell. Yeah, and I even noticed little things that I definitely wouldn't have noticed if I wasn't using a crossbow. And I'm going to keep coming back to this because I really like how my game experience changed. So he has this breath attack that sways from side to side, and I noticed that like the animation and the hitbox aren't the same size, but like to your advantage. Like the tip of the breath doesn't do any damage, so you can actually like stand there, and it's actually the same distance from the tip of the breath to him as the same distance as the max lock on distance. Which I think is intentional, but you can stand in the very tip of the breath and like shoot at him if you can get there in time. But in general, I agree with you. I really like that all of From's bosses have really good tells. They're not, so over the top that they're trivial, but, you have to see them like 10, 15 times in order to get this, like, intuitive ability to react fast enough to them. Like, it's a challenge to identify and react accordingly.
Yeah, and the idea is that those actual the actual attacks, they need to be very threatening, but in different ways. Like
Yes.
a sweep attack is very threatening because of the area it covers. It's not easy to avoid by changing your positioning slightly. You're going to get hit no matter where you are in front of the boss. But usually you can use your iframes to roll through it if it's fast moving. If it's a fast moving sweep, you have more room to hit the iframe sweet spot. Whereas a big overhead attack, like Manus, for example, has this really good overhead attack. Manus is like a ferocious boss. He attacks really, really quickly. From the
Yes.
start of a swipe to the end of a swipe is like that. It's a snap. So you need to be really on the ball with reacting the moment you see him swipe. But he has this one attack where he raises his hand over his head, and then slams it down on you. But he hangs the hand in the air for like half a second. And I stuffed it up all the time because every single one of his other attacks is almost instantaneous. So you pretty much roll straight away. But with this one, you need to delay your roll just a tiny bit more. And just that little adjustment added a kind of threat and interesting facet to this boss with such a small thing. But that's what you want from an interesting boss. You want little wrinkles that change how you play, that threaten you in interesting ways.
Yeah, Manus in particular was quite difficult with the crossbow fight because, he
Understandable,
attacks
yeah.
so fast. So because you have that 1 second window where you're vulnerable, you gotta react exactly at the time. There are these bits where you can shoot him, but you have to constantly be running backwards, trying to get out of his like range. Because different bosses, depending on your playstyle, have these ranges that you want to play at. Calamite, for example, when you're in a melee build, it's advantageous to. So Calamite's a big black dragon, and it's very advantageous to play at its front foot, because that kind of lets you dodge a bunch of its attacks in melee. With the range build, I found that I had to just be way further back all the time, but not so far back that it would trigger a couple of its breath attacks that I found quite difficult to dodge. It's got this frontal straight line breath attack that will insta kill you if I'm standing there in my reload animation. So I had to fight the boss close enough that it wouldn't use that attack, but not far back enough that I could be, hit with its others. I find it quite interesting that these bosses are so well designed that they can be a completely different experience based on the way that you're fighting them with what weapons, great swords or short swords, daggers, even magic. They do. I think the DLC bosses and the later bosses in From's catalog do a good job of accounting for different playstyles. Although, stuff early on, maybe not so much.
I think, big picture, one of the things that is notable about these bosses compared to the later stages, later From Software games, is that From has basically made it in all their later games that bosses have two stages, at least two stages, whether they get a power up halfway through their health bar disappearing, or they just have multiple stages, you clear one health point, and then a second one spawns. That really is only a thing for like Ornstein and Smo. Like Manus has it as well,
Manus has it.
where he starts using dark magic. Artorias powers up, so they have it a little bit, but that aspect of boss fights is one that is missing a bit here. I guess you could say Gargoyles has it because the second Gargoyle enters. It's inconsistent throughout, but in the newer From Software games, they give every boss a second stage because it's just more fun to have the challenge move to a whole new level in some interesting way.
Yeah, it's like once you've solved it, you go into the fight and you'd have to do the same thing for 10 minutes or something. That's kind of boring. But if you solve phase 1 and then you get to phase 2, it's like they can double up on that, that fun learning experience in the same boss. And, I do like the design, but I kind of think they're starting to overuse it. I prefer when this phase 2 is like almost like an oh shit moment. I think Ludwig in Bloodborne is the perfect example of a holy shit kind of phase 2. Whereas, there's some other things, it's like whatever.
I like all phase 2, phase 3s. Dark Souls 3 has Frida, and she's got 3 distinct stages, which is awesome.
I've seen that fight, yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And of course, the final fight in Sekiro against Ishin is technically a 4-stage boss fight, although the first stage is kind of a gimmick. But yeah, I think that it adds a lot, and it makes these bosses seem a bit bland in comparison. So there are some good bosses here, particularly in the DLC, but on the whole, they're just not as good as the modern From Software games. That doesn't mean that they're still not very good. It just means that they have improved on this aspect of the game dramatically. So let's have another quick music break, James. There was another one you wanted to do. We can do it as a break from the boss. Was it the end credits or something?
Yeah, it was the end credits. So the end credits is my favorite piece of music in the whole game, just because of how poignant it is and how well it kind of serves as a capstone to the whole game. This moment of reflection post this big dramatic moment that was the final moments. I really enjoyed it, and I'd like to share with you.
we're getting towards the end of our discussion, but there was one more thing I wanted to bring up from my notes before we wrap up. And that is the mechanical obscurity of a lot of things that are happening in Dark Souls. So I am super into the story obscurity and the lack of information you have about the world and the way that you need to piece it all together. What really irritates me and what I think is bad about Dark Souls is the mechanical obscurity. There are mechanics in this game that don't ever really get explained in a clear way, and there are ways to tease out that information if you're, in the help menu long enough, but it's not particularly transparent. And a lot of what I learned had to be explained to me, or I later understood when I looked it up on wikis. So some examples of that are poise. Poise is a hugely important statistic in Dark Souls and in all of these action RPGs that have copied it. Basically, there's a damage threshold that will stagger you, and there's a damage threshold that will stagger enemies. So a little dagger poking away against a heavily armored foe won't stagger it. A big heavy sword might. If you're wearing lots of heavy armor, you won't get staggered. If you're not wearing much armor at all, it won't take much damage to stagger you. And poise has a dramatic effect on your character and enemy characters and the strength of different weapons and different attacks. It's not explained to you at all. Poise is almost like a hidden mechanic. There's a ring you can find in the early game that increases poise, and it's a hidden stat on one of the menus. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking for it.
Yeah, it's kind of something that you learn by feel, I'm going to say, over the course of your runtime. Like, you notice that lots of big enemies are really hard to stagger, and the lighter ones stagger with, like, the lightest touch. And, you equip a heavier weapon and something will stagger back. So I kind of like these kinds of mechanics that you learn naturally through play. I think that they feel more, it's you say that they're obscure, but to me, these communicate themselves the most naturally to the player. I didn't know that poise had a name for it, like it was mechanically obscure, but I understood the concept through playing, and I kind of enjoy learning mechanics that way rather than just reading a tutorial on them. I find it more intuitive, and I feel like I'm getting better and learning about the game world.
You actually raise a good point. Poise is the kind of thing that you do kind of get an intuitive understanding. I just remember opening a wiki page that explained it for the first time, and it was like a light bulb moment. It's like, how have I played this game for this long and not known what poise is? Another example is kindling and being unable to kindle while hollowed, and the way summoning works. They can only do it while human. Once again, it's all obvious to me now. Like, I understand all this, but the first time I played it through, I had no idea what any of this was. You go to kindle the bonfire and it says you cannot kindle while hollowed, and you're like, what the fuck is this game talking about? Like, what is going on? It's not like you can press help on that menu and it says, this is what kindling is, and you are currently hollowed. It's just kind of sitting there in the background. I think that the newer games tutorialize a lot of this stuff and explain their mechanics in a way that I appreciate far more. Like, particularly Sekiro. Sekiro is a game where they had to introduce a whole bunch of new mechanics, and I think that it does a far better job explaining its complicated mechanics to you than Dark Souls does.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I kind of... See, I feel that there's this connection between the mechanical obscurity and the obscure nature of the world. I get that you want that to be distinct, but to me, the mechanics being confusing along with the story being confusing works together to form a cohesive whole, and I really like that.
What I will give you is that I think that it does add to the mystical allure of Dark Souls. Like, Dark Souls being mysterious in this way does make the game feel a bit more special and hard to decipher. NPC quest lines are similar in that they're incredibly obscure, but once again, this is the type of obscurity I can get behind. One of the things I love about this game is how the NPCs kind of are not they don't just stand around with a quest marker over their head. They all have journeys that they go on as you play the game, and they'll just disappear and you'll have no idea where they've gone. And I mean, I love that. People have complained that it's frustrating to do certain NPCs' quest lines and stuff, and to me, that kind of misses the point. If you're frustrated about an NPC's questline, look it up. But otherwise, what it adds to the world is it makes it feel more alive. Because these people, instead of being quest dispensers, actually have their own lives and they go on and about and they do their own thing. So I'm not opposed to this obscurity in a general sense. I just think that something as fundamental as kindling and how kindling works, I think it should be explained to the player. And I think that Dark Souls goes a bit too much in this direction.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think maybe there is some wiggle room here. Like, if you started the game and there was 100 message boxes that told you what every stat did and what... That would be awful, right? And completely go against the themes of the game.
It's really funny because Demon Souls literally does that. At the bottom of the Nexus, as a stairs, there's about 25 messages that the developers left, which are all just tutorial tips. And yes, it's kind of awkward. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up, Jimmy?
We're pushing to a bit over 2 hours now, and I'm looking to edit this tomorrow. It's making me cry on the inside, but, you do what you have to do. No, I think we've mostly touched on everything. We haven't spoken about graphics, but as a how is this hold up thing, it doesn't seem fair to, compare a graphical upgrade from a couple years ago to these older retro games we've been reviewing.
Basically, it looks alright. The end.
Yeah.
Could be better.
So, Patrick, final and thoughts, and, we don't have all night.
Dark Souls is a magnificent game. It's not my favorite game of all time. From historically, I think it's one of the most influential and one of the most important games ever made. But from the perspective of this show, has Dark Souls stood the test of time? The answer is an easy yes. But it has a lot of flaws. It has a lot of problems compared to the modern takes that From Software has done. From has, in most ways, considerably upped their game. Where I think Dark Souls is still unparalleled today is in its macro level design and in its storytelling and its world design. I think Bloodborne probably has the best environmental story and the most interesting story. But I really love Dark Souls' subversion of the hero's journey and the density of the world that's created. I think it's better than Dark Souls 2, 3s, and Sekiro. So it's got a superb story and incredible level design. You might find the combat a little too easy. You might find some of the bosses a little boring. But the quality here is still really high, and moving through its level and world is still incredibly enjoyable today. Dark Souls is a fantastic game. It's not as good as it was when it was released in 2011, but it is still well worth your time to play, and you should definitely play it. Highly recommended.
For me, Dark Souls 1 is probably my number one favorite game to replay. I think that the sheer breadth of options that you have available to you when playing through this game, coupled with the fact that you can proceed through the game world in a number of different ways, that you're not bogged down by NPCs giving you exposition over and over and over again, means this is a fantastic experience on a second, third, fourth, fifth playthrough, something that I can't say for a lot of games that I also love. I think that this game really shines in its moment-to-moment mechanics. It feels really good to play. Your character has this sense of weight behind each of his attacks, and most of all, I enjoy that every single enemy in this game poses a significant threat to the player. There is no throwaway enemies in this game that are boring to fight. Everything is there for a purpose. There is no mashing through mindless encounters. You have to be on your toes at all times, aware of traps, things around the corner, and I really think that it's engaging from start to finish because of that. I think that the story shines in its world building. I think that it is a bit weaker in its plot. However, the breadth and scale of the effort that the writers have put in behind the scene is very obvious, and it pays dividends in a big way. The boss fights have aged poorly in the base game, but the DLC bosses are some of the best in gaming, in my opinion, Artorias being my favourite boss of all time. I would highly recommend Dark Souls 1 to anybody who hasn't checked it out, and would thoroughly recommend anybody who is thinking of bouncing off it to stick with it through some tough, difficult first hours for a truly rewarding experience.
And don't put on Havel's armor. Ever.
No, put it on and use the crossbow.
Okay, so that about wraps it up. Thank you everyone for listening to this marathon of a discussion on Dark Souls. We are the Retrospectives podcast. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I was joined today by my co-host James Turlings. You can find all of our content on our website, rspodcast.net. It's got links to all of our podcasts, including a bunch of articles that James and I have written, including my stunning dissertation on how Lunar Silver Star Story is the worst game I've ever played. So if you hate JRPGs as much as I do, you might enjoy that one. We're available anywhere you would listen to podcasts, including Spotify, so you can download it directly off our website, stream it on the website, or listen on a podcatcher, whatever suits you. More than anything, we would love if you would come and join our Discord community, particularly in light of the fact that we're doing our mailbag episode next fortnight. Our Discord is a hotbed of discussion and argument for games old and new, and we would love for you to join it. If you have enjoyed listening to the show and you have literally any question about games we've played for the podcast, or modern games, or our opinions on philosophy in gaming, or whatever it is, we would love to hear from you. So if you would like to drop on down our Discord, please do pose a question to get ready for our mailbag episode.
Yeah, the mailbag was fun last year, and if you want to ask really offbeat questions, those are the questions I encourage. I think my favourite question that's been asked so far is, what is your favourite sandwich? And we'll have to wait till next fortnight to hear the gripping revelation from myself and Patrick. So if you have anything weird to ask, go ahead. We'd love to answer them. This is obviously an episode more geared to our long-time listeners of 2 years max, but yeah, love to hear from you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for listening today and letting me gush on about Dark Souls. Thank you to you, James, for letting me do Dark Souls for episode 50.
Well, I mean, I get 2 episodes in a row as a repayment, so I hope you look forward to that. I think the first game is probably going to be Civilization 4, but we'll talk about that more closer to the date. If anyone has any good suggestions for games Patrick will hate, I'm always open.
So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next fortnight for the mailbag episode.
See ya.